Good afternoon and welcome to this fourth Eaton Bridge webinar of 2022. How do boards create and cultivate an inclusive organisation? My name is Louise Chaplin. I head up the board practice at Eaton Bridge Partners. And this afternoon, I'm delighted to be joined by Kirsty Bashforth, who's the Chief Business Officer at Boardroom and on the board of Serco and PZ Cousins, and Louis Cooper, the CEO of the Non-Executive Directors Association. Before we get started on the discussion, I'd be keen to give you an overview of Eaton Bridge activity and our sense of the market, and also what we see as perhaps key trends going forward. So from supporting our clients from both an interim and a search perspective, we've seen a big uptick in activity internationally. In the Middle East, we've seen an increased demand certainly from interim and transformation placements, and we've also seen from our new consulting arm some key developments in terms of supporting clients that are housed in the Middle East, but supporting their regional offices internationally. So I think from our perspective, activity, whilst the economic climate within the UK going ahead might be challenging, the international opportunities are certainly key. And I think thinking about candidates from an international perspective, candidates seem to be keen to move, they seem keen to explore new opportunities. From a growth perspective, what we're seeing as well is that enterprise-wide transformations, organizational development and OD structures are being looked at both in the boardroom and across the business. So we've seen a huge amount of activity from an HR perspective, as well as from our business transformation side. That's not taking away from any activity that we've seen from our key pillars from board and the finance practice as well. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion, it was lovely to see so many friendly faces and people from our network on the participant list. And thank you very much for your insight and pre-questions for this discussion. I'd like to now invite Kirsty Bashforth to join us to share a little bit about her background and her views on inclusion and how that impacts in her roles. Kirsty.
Thanks, Louise, and it's great to be here. Actually talking to you from Malmo over in Sweden today, which is where my role is based and where I spend sort of a few days every 3 weeks while in between traveling to other places. So just a little bit more about what I do. I mix executive and non-executive career. So obviously I have a full-time exec job, and somehow I also in that 100% have 2 FTSE board roles. So I chair the remuneration committee on PZ Cousins, a FTSE 250, and I chair the corporate responsibility committee on Serco Group, which is also a FTSE 250. So I clearly like making lots of lists and being busy, which it is, but the mix of exec and non-exec worlds means I do get both perspectives. I have to wear a lot of hats, but there is learnings I can take from both. I'm 8 years a FTSE PLC director, and I've also been director on the boards of family-owned, private equity, and public organisations. So I've got that mix of ownership as well. And before that, I was 24 years at BP. So I've worked in a huge big corporate, which was amazing. And having looked at the registration list, there's a couple of ex-colleagues on this group today, so nice to have you with us. And just before we started, I was asked to take a think about how inclusion, the topic of inclusion, and how does that impact board discussions, and also how does it impact the activities of exec and non-exec discussions. And on that board discussions, I've sort of got about 4 or 5 points I want to share to start it off. I think it's now become core, as it should, for a number of reasons. And COVID is one of those that has elevated, to me, a topic that was on the move anyway, but has elevated it right to the top of board discussions. I think all of us remember those times that suddenly everybody, how is your staff? Who's included? Where is everybody? Went right to the top of the agenda. So that's the first one. I think a second one is governance has cementing inclusion as an important thing. We all know the governance updates that have happened over the last few years means that it's become requirement, quite right, to comply or explain. And shareholders, media, and investors are expecting it too in their decisions. I think another one is ESG continues to shift it. People are now putting it into their metrics, so it becomes regular part of the board discussions. And of course, all of us are employees of somebody, and employee choice is now underpinning it. It's not a nice to have. People expect to feel included, expect to feel that they should and can be themselves. So that's just, it's become core to the board discussion because it's in every aspect of the business that a non-exec is working on. In terms of leadership impact on discussions, from an exec point of view, I see now execs are running all sorts of inclusion forums. That's not nice to have. Again, it's expected part of the employee conversation. For example, at Circa, where I'm on the board, there's all sorts of inclusion hubs, and us as non-exec directors take part. I'll be taking part in a wellbeing one in about 13 days' time. It's forming part of incentives now, particularly in ESG elements, going into executives' remuneration. And I think we do have to remember, though, that it's not for the board to set the culture, it's management to set the culture and manage the culture. And if the board thinks that management is not doing that, then the board needs to change the management. But it's really core in executives. And then on non-execs, I think in terms of inclusion, we are much more in focus with employees. We are visible. We are expected to be seen as regular human beings, not some remote distance people who have the lifts held open for them all day, as I remember used to happen. I used to see board members like sort of hallowed beings have the lift held open. That's not how it is. A board member has to be relevant and accessible, and board members need to go out and actively seek their own test points of how the culture is in an organization, because it's also a very good mark of how the management's doing. And there is also finally a lot more thought about how boards are constructed now, as they should be, and how those individuals come together and work together as an inclusive team, because how the board works has impact on how the management works, and therefore has an impact on how the culture works. So just some initial thoughts on what has become, and hopefully absolutely remains, a core topic. It's not a nice to have. It's not an initiative. This is a core part of what a non-exec as an individual and as a board member thinks about and works on every day.
Kirsty, thank you. Louis, please do join us on the screen, and it'd be great just to hear a little bit about the work you're doing with NIDA and what you're seeing in the market at the moment.
Thanks, Louise. So just to introduce myself, I'm the CEO of the Non-Executive Directors Association, NEDA, and we are very much an association focused on our members and work with them from cradle to grave in terms of their life cycle of being a non-executive director. And a lot of the work we do is around training, education, and mentoring and advising. But we also undertake a range of other board services, particularly around governance, risk, and assurance services. And as part of that activity, we have been looking at culture and the ramifications of equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think Kirsty set out a very good overview of all the key areas, and I would endorse everything that Kirsty ran through. I think it is such a broad area, and it is very much the heart of the company, and it needs tangible actions and positive outcomes. And I think there needs to be a common understanding of what it actually means for the organisation itself, so that you really value people for who they are and also for what they do. I think from a board perspective, I've got 3 C's actually, just to sort of focus attention. I think you're a catalyst in terms of making it important and making sure that there is a degree of action. I think, as Kirsty said, it is very much a an executive management activity, but I think the board really needs to provide some degree of guidance and overview in terms of how things are moving forward. It is a change activity, so you do need to make sure that you're comfortable with change and that you measure the change and that the impact of the change actually comes through. It is a cultural activity in terms of you're looking at behaviours across the organisation and at different levels within the organisation. And the fourth C, I think, is communication, and that needs to be at all levels, at all times. It needs to be consistent and it needs to be engaging. So that's catalyst, change, culture, communication. I think those are some of the four sort of key elements of board activity. I think from what we're seeing, I think it does really focus attention on the governance of the organisation, as Kirsty said. I think it's really understanding how the company is managed and controlled. And we often get involved in health checks, just a sense check, how the governance activity is actually bearing up. What's the current view? Where should it be in the future? Creating some degree of a gap analysis to see if there are any areas to improve. Two elements that I think drive things forward, which link very much into diversity and inclusion in particular, is understanding the purpose of the organisation. What is it there to do? What are the values that the organisation holds dear, and how does it communicate to make sure that everybody is on message in terms of that purpose of the organisation? Because that then relates to the people within the organisation, and quite often there can be a disconnect between those areas. And I think strategy is key to this in setting the right objectives for the organisation. And I think we're seeing diversity and inclusion really being picked up in terms of part of that strategy delivery, part of that strategy implementation, part of that strategy measuring process. So you need to be measuring the right things and focusing attention on the right areas. And I think diversity and inclusion is very much part of that process. And it links into culture, it links into capabilities, it links into ethics, doing the right things and that sort of thing. So I think it is very much geared up into those areas. And I think a lot of this is driven by the board leadership itself, in terms of the chair leads the board, and the chair should be really directing board activity and working closely with the CEO, who obviously drives the company perspective. And I think there needs to be clear sponsorship, there needs to be clear mandates in this area, so you're really setting the tone. And it links in very much, I think, with board effectiveness. We've undertaken a number of effectiveness and performance reviews recently, and have been looking at how boards have been dealing with culture and have been dealing with people in particular. And I think some of this comes back to looking at the board itself. Again, as Kirsty noted, I think board composition needs to be key to this area as well. And I think it's also asking questions, which we'll probably move on to a bit later on, in terms of are we attracting the right breed of NED going forward? Have we actually got the people side covered? And I think from what we've seen, it is underrepresented. And I think we need a lot more attention in terms of bringing new people on board. I was at a session with the Guild of HR Professionals this week, and it's very much on their agenda in terms of the way that HR is positioned within the organisation and positioned at board level. And I think we could be seeing some new sort of roles coming through in terms of, you know, the chief behavioural officer and sort of other types of roles that are going to really centre attention in terms of how this area is being picked up. And I think also the other point, just to close, is the question a lot of boards are asking is do we need a separate board committee or subcommittee of the board to focus on this area in particular? And I was reading the other day, one organisation has already put in a customer conduct and ethics committee. We're also seeing ESG committees popping up, very much focusing on the three elements of the ES and G. And also the remuneration committee, I think, is also looking more broadly at not just executive pay, but also the other elements of culture and people, which you need to pick up on in the organisation generally. So back to you, Louise.
Louis, thank you very much, and welcome back, Kirsty. So thank you all for submitting your insights on the poll questions. I shall remind you of the questions. I'm going to take, you answered 4 questions. It's always interesting to get the data back. So the first question was, how clear is your inclusion agenda? 49% said very clear, 27% unclear, and 24% not set. Second question around, is your leadership team setting the right tone and driving the inclusion agenda? Yes on 78% and no on 22%. So Kirsty, to kick off with you, if I may, it'd be good just to get your view on those 2 questions together, because they're obviously clearly interlinked, but it'd be great just to hear your insight.
So just repeat those again. Those were is the agenda set, and is the leadership setting the right tone?
Yeah, how clear is your inclusion agenda?
So first thoughts when I looked at the questions back was, oh, there's some quite positive results here. So I was being a bit provocative, and if everybody thinks everything's fine, I'm fascinated as to your participation today. Is it because actually, when you reflect, it's maybe not quite so positive? Is it you just want some new learnings, or is it you're actually worried about what's coming down the pipeline and actually let's be a bit more paranoid? For whatever reason, I just found it quite interesting. I was not expecting such positive results. So in a sense, I'm an optimist. I'll take that. It's good. But there's always opportunities to do better. I think on inclusion agenda, and Louis mentioned this, it's such a broad topic. What do we mean by inclusion? And everybody has a different definition of it, the same as people used to have a different definition of performance, which of course is now changing and broadening because of ESG. Good. So the question is, what do we mean by inclusion? But I think that for everybody, that means, are we making it important? I'm going to paraphrase. I think, do we feel we're making it important enough? And it doesn't surprise me that probably, 50% are not quite clear, because I see this as evolves all of the time. It evolves contextually. It evolves according to your strategy. It evolves as all of us are looking at different sorts of talent. People who want to come into organizations now, all of us are thinking about different ways to live our life and focus our careers. And so I think we need to be agile and nimble, and leadership needs to think this as not as a one-off, we're done, we've got the inclusion agenda set, but as a constantly evolving, have we got our ears to the ground? Does this fit the strategy? Does this fit the talent that we need? Does this fit the talent who wants to come here? Do people, it's much more a marketing exercise now to try find the right people than it is to expect that just because you're a big organization, people will just want to turn up and even more than that, stay. And all leaders, what part of the organization they're at, need to think of this as core part of your role is to get the best out of your people. And that means people should want to give their best, but they need to belong. Leadership, I think, is evolving, changing, and an inclusion agenda needs to evolve and change. And one interesting note on one of the companies I'm on a board on, they've got so much inclusion agenda going on. They're actually now thinking about, do we flip this around and say, who are we excluding by being so inclusive? And do we need to think about this the other way around, that there are some people who are now feeling excluded because they're not part of the inclusion agenda because they are generally mainstream. And it's and that's an evolution in their thinking. So it's good that leadership is starting to set the tone. We always need to do more. I think a mindset of vulnerability here is really important, and that we should all continue learning. And I think any inclusion agenda is evolving, and we all need to go out and be curious about what does inclusion mean to others? Just a few thoughts.
Thank you, Kirsty. And Louis, thinking about the second 2 questions, is inclusion agenda a priority in the boardroom for your business? 74% said yes, 26% said no. And do you feel there's an inclusive culture in your business? 78% said yes. And I think one of the words, Kirsty, you used was around belonging. And I think, how do you belong? And when a lot of businesses have hired significantly during lockdown, do they belong? And do they feel we might be imparting an inclusive culture onto individuals, but actually, do they feel belong? Do they feel part of the organization? And how do we know whether they belong or not? Louis, from a boardroom perspective and the work you do around sort of the board assessment side, does that come through strongly as sort of discussion topics?
I think it does, and I think it's a really positive result, I think, in terms of the third question, in terms of inclusion on the agenda, because if things are on the agenda, they tend to get done. And I think certain areas in the past have found themselves off agenda, or at least they're on the agenda, but they don't get covered because we've got other important things to consider. So I think the agenda point is a key one. And I think through the pandemic period as well, as Kirsty said earlier on, I think people were really given a lot of focus of attention, which was right in terms of the ability to make sure they can work, communicate, and get fully involved in business operations. So I think we've probably learned from that as well going forward, in terms of the importance of focusing on people and making sure that we really look after and keep our people. I think something that we're looking at the moment, I'm doing a number of risk-related exercises, and what's coming through strongly across the board there, I've got 3 on the go at the moment, and all 3 are looking at their talents and their people, retaining people, thinking about the diversity and inclusion aspect as part of that process as well. So I think it is actually an area that is really gaining a lot of attention at the moment. And I think a lot of this comes back to the HR community as well, in terms of HR really pushing this forward in terms of their leadership, their interaction with the board. And I think it demonstrates the credibility of the HR community in terms of how this is sort of moving forward and playing out. The other thing coming through strongly, I think, going back to that sort of boring sort of governance area, I think it is central to looking at how organisations operate and how they tick. And I don't know if you've seen a paper that came out, I think, just before Christmas. The FRC did a paper called Creating a Positive Culture. And I think they did a good job in terms of looking at 2 main areas. What are the opportunities and enablers that we really need to focus on? And what are some of the challenges and barriers? And just to give you sort of an overview, I think from the opportunities and enablers, it is very much looking at the frameworks and the consistency of how you look at these areas, targeting people who are at different levels within the organisation, particularly the people leaders and middle managers, because sometimes they can be a block in terms of some of the messages going through. Also, the term positive psychology, which I've heard a lot more recently, in terms of making sure that people feel that they can speak up, make people feel that their word is actually being listened to, and they're not afraid to speak up through that sort of process. Also, the language being used, making sure that there's a common understanding of some of these areas. The data, I think, is key as well in terms of measuring activities in these areas in particular. I think there are some requirements now, obviously, with gender pay and other elements, which is fairly mandatory. But I think people are also looking at good people data that we can then make decisions from. We can then make sure that we've got some evidence that things are gaining momentum. And also the focus on consultation and key roles within the organisation. So we're seeing, again, things like culture ambassadors and different people in different guises that will help the process move forward. And I think some of the challenges and barriers are trying to get over this cultural heritage of, we don't want to change, we're comfortable with the status quo. The problem is that the world we live in is changing, and it's changing very quickly. And if organisations don't change, they are going to get left behind. So I think that culture needs to come through strongly. And also the subcultures within the organisation need to be dealt with in terms of making sure that there's a clear understanding of what the culture actually means, and making sure that we look at the impact on individuals, that what's going to happen with individuals and key groups. And I think that was really interesting what Kirsty was saying there in terms of flipping that sort of concept over in terms of being inclusive, but not actually being inclusive to certain groups and certain individuals. And I think some of this is down to the fear of the unknown and fear of change generally, that people don't always see a positive out of it. They think it's going to have an impact on them, which will be a negative impact. So I think that's through the messaging and the way that we communicate a lot of this information is key to that process, I think. So there's some really good examples, I think, in terms of aspects to look at, to challenge, to benchmark against, and just make sure that you're on the right track. And I think boards are sensitive to that as well now. I think that's why it's on the agenda and why they're really looking at it, to link it into strategy, to link it into risk, and see it part and parcel of the overall process, rather than hiving it off as a separate initiative or a separate project, and go down a blind alley with some of this and just tick a box to say that we're doing something. So I think if you've got some people at the top, particularly the chair, the CEO, and the HR team in particular, then I think it's going to resonate and actually gain some degree of momentum.
Great, thank you, Louis. And
Louise, can I add in just an insight from something that's sort of live, and I'm relating it to the question that's on the screen from Alison on level of psychological safety, which Louis brought up, because another sort of subcultures in the organisation, as Louis mentioned, this may seem counterintuitive, but I think we need to not forget leadership as a subculture that needs to feel included as well. And we spend, and that may sound odd, and doesn't that sound selfish, but actually, unless leadership feels included, leadership can't create inclusion and perpetuate inclusion. And I think this is where COVID and how we all had to work has made a couple of interesting, brought to me a couple of interesting insights. So for example, in a boardroom, if any of you on the call are in boards, typically, much as you all say we don't, we all end up sitting in similar places when we walk in a room. It's just, I don't know what, it's habit. But what COVID did was, you're all on a screen and you're all the same size tile. And therefore there's no natural somebody sits at the end, or somebody's not part of the conversation, or there's a natural room hierarchy. You're all the same size tile on the screen. And actually everybody has to take their turn in speaking, because it's really clear, nobody can dominate the conversation inadvertently. So there's a really interesting potential inclusion thing to carry on from COVID for leadership, however that works. There's another one that we've trialed out here is, we have a top leadership community of about 160 of us. And we have a very crowded agenda with loads and loads of great projects and initiatives. But how do you keep enough people feeling included and up to speed on them when not everybody needs to know everything? And we were facing a sort of, but here comes another initiative from corporate, and I'm trying my best. So we set up, and it's enormous work, and I feel like I'm the showrunner for the Netflix series. It's sort of exhausting, but it's paying dividends. We've set up what we call it here in Sweden, Swedish fikas. So that's like a coffee break. So 40 minutes every second Thursday at 1300 CET, we have a Teams meeting where we invite all of the 160, and it's a standard time, and it starts on time and it finishes on time, and we switch it off at the end. And it's 20 minutes input, 15 minutes breakouts on Zoom or Teams, whatever it is, and 5 minutes wrap up at the end. And it's on a company-wide topic, whether that's the engagement survey or a new project that everybody needs to get up to speed on. And we found that it's helping create, just keep people educated and up to speed with what's going on. It's to that change point that Louis mentioned as well, which is if people don't feel included, we all make up our own story. And this prevents that, rumors start because this is happening and that's happening. No, here's the stuff, here's the people doing it, here's the pack afterwards, here's the recording, and everybody's invited. And we've done 13 of these now since last December. As I say, exhausting. I'm running the pipeline, etc., checking everybody's presentations, making sure they're really clear. You stick to your 20 minutes. We're getting over 60% of the leadership community are turning up every time, totally voluntary, wherever they are: Kazakhstan, Argentina, Albania, UK. So just a couple of thoughts there about leadership, about subcultures and focusing on leadership, because we mustn't forget us as a group, because we can't do a decent job unless we're actually feeling included ourselves.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kirsty.
Just picking up actually on some of that dialogue, I think the NED can often feel excluded in terms of understanding what's going on within the organisation. I think particularly with the COVID situation, not being able to walk the floor and actually sort of touch and feel and understand the sort of the cultural aspects of the organisation. I think it's important for the NED to make sure, as you said earlier on, Kirsty, that they actually are seen and visible, and they're actually part of the operations in terms of being able to do that. And they can feel the excluded group, I think, sometimes, because they just dive in and out of meetings and don't really get a good sort of sense check. So I think it's a really good point that you're making in terms of how that can actually work and resonate with individuals.
And yeah, and final point, Louise, then I'll we'll let you take back over. Sorry, to just build on that, the one way around that when you can't get out and about is get, as a non-exec, join one of the inclusion webinars or chats, because you can actually get a real sense of a diagonal slice of the organization who's interested in a particular topic, but from all over the organization. But you as an ed can either take part, listen, just educate yourself. Anyway, just a thought. I'll be quiet.
Thank you. And I think I was going to share a little bit about two recent board roles I've just had the privilege of supporting within the FTSE, and both of which the chairman, when I took the briefings for the roles, said, Louisa, we need to have somebody that's going to inject some fun and some energy. This has got to be, you know, it's my job. One of them is a internally promoted chair onto the board. It's FTSE 350. My job is to create and manage that team culture, and the team is the board, but also then to create energy for the rest of the organisation. And he said, and I've got to guide those NEDs to be able to go out and find out what's going on in the organisations, not just rely on doing it remotely, and be part of the organisation as well. So I think it's very much on chairs' agendas now in terms of the team of a board, but also how does the boardroom be part of the organisation from an inclusive perspective. So we have got a number of people I know that are willing to share their insight this afternoon. So the first question, if I may, Zoe, in terms of, it'd be great to get your view on, has there been a positive or negative impact on inclusion in your organisation since hybrid working has been introduced? So you've got four options: no impact and no change, positive impact, part of a renewed social focus, negative impact due to home working, or unsure. I think we should have the figures coming up now, and it'll be fascinating to see what you think on that. So a positive impact has won through at 56%, part of renewed social focus. Not necessarily surprising, I don't think. Negative impact due to home working is still at 12%, and no impact and no change at 20%. I suppose it's the ones with no impact and no change I'm most intrigued about. But Kirsty, your view on the data?
As a natural optimist, I always think out of difficulty, find there's always an opportunity, and I think we've seen there. It brings to life a couple of the examples I mentioned earlier about, you know, actually everybody's the same size tile on the screen. Is what in one thing, you know, how we've had to work has actually in some ways leveled the playing field. I think it has been difficult though for new joiners. I mean, everybody on this call will not be at the first start of their career. And I think for people who are straight into the workforce, it's probably, we should probably all ask them. Because I know, for example, my eldest son is just about to go and do a year in industry in his third year in uni. And he's really keen to be able to have some office time. You know, yes, he wants more about choice and flexibility than he does about, I just don't want to be near an office. So I think for many people, it's had some positives. For some, I think we as leaders have to work really hard to not say we're done, this is the new norm, but understand that we haven't yet quite found what that new norm is. I think people are still working it out. And in some places, you know, COVID's still raging on. But I do think what has shifted is this social focus. Yeah, this idea about wellness is now, again, not a nice to have. Wellness is a core part of your employee value proposition, and you've got to think of it as such, act as such. And when I say role model, I don't mean everybody, all leaders have got to be paragons of virtue, because you can't all be and do the same, but at least talk about it, be honest about it, be open and vulnerable about where you yourself are not getting it right. I'm a bit of a disaster, really. I mean, I manage way too many things, but it's what makes me thrive. It wouldn't work for somebody else. So yeah, some really interesting results there. I think there are some positives, and we're not yet into I'm not sure whether we ever will be into a new norm. I think it will just continue to evolve, but it'll be much more bespoke than it used to be.
Thank you. And Kirsty, I think you are very much an example of how hybrid working is very effective, both from an exec and non-exec perspective, and also managing a global team.
Does hybrid include working on a train and a plane? Very effective place to work.
I'm mindful of time and keen to move on to the next poll question. Now, Lou, it'd be great to get your insight once we've got the feedback. Is the focus of culture in updated governance codes and guidance making a difference? So are we able to get that question up? Great. So no difference or not considered. Yes, the board is now much more engaged. Yes, but progress is slow and unsure. So it would be great if you could just make your choices, and we should get some stats in a couple of seconds. There we go. So yes, the board is now much more engaged, 39%. Yes, but progress is slow. I think perhaps not unsurprising. A significant portion of unsure, which may be to do with communication from the boardroom, and no difference not considered. Louis, over to you. It'd be great to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not surprised actually, because I think the codes and the frameworks and the regulatory side has actually stepped up a gear over the last couple of years with new updates to guidelines and codes, etc., particularly with larger organisations. So I think culture came into that a lot more strongly in terms of a key area to focus on, which I don't think was there to such a great extent previously. And also, I think it linked into what I was saying earlier on in terms of that purpose of the organisation and understanding the strategy of the organisation going forward, and linking some of these things in a way that wasn't actually carried out before. So I think it's really making sure that you understand what is fit for purpose for you as an organisation. A lot of the codes and guidelines, I think, are fairly flexible and very much mindful of different sizes of organisation will have different requirements and will approach these in different ways. So I think it's really making sure that you've got something that works for you, but it does help to, I think, embed and to integrate a lot of this activity, because as we said earlier on, it doesn't sort of hive it off as something separate. It is seen to be part and parcel of what we're doing. And I think the other linkage into this is the sort of section 172 area as well, in terms of individual directors' duties, because I think that again has resulted in people looking at the broader stakeholder groups within the organisation. And there's been a lot more reporting in terms of who your stakeholders are, and that very much, again, is locked into the internal stakeholder groups as well. So I think organisations have been doing things like stakeholder mapping and getting a good grip of who the stakeholders are, what different groups we need to focus on. And now, because you're required for larger companies in particular to report on that information and really focus attention on the success of the company in terms of the duties of individual directors, is, I think, a bit more of a coming together in terms of what does that mean for our organisation and how does that link into workforce engagement in particular. And there were three options that came through with the update in the main code in particular. You either put an employee on the board to represent the interests of the employees, you set up a workforce advisory panel, or you had a designated NED who was going to act as the link. Very few people took the route of putting an employee on the board. There were a few companies who did that. But I think there's always been some concern about confidentiality of information. And once you become a board member, it may be very difficult to undertake sort of employee activities as well. So I think the Workforce Advisory Panel and the designated NED have come out on top at the moment in terms of that workforce engagement. And I think it's the workforce terminology now as well, in terms of there are different ways of working within an organisation. Not everybody is a pure sort of employee. So there are different elements of work that relate to the individual and how they engage with the organisation. And I think the third point on that, in terms of the designated NED, the NED is then taking on more responsibility in this area and is acting more as the link between the board and the workforce generally. So I think some interesting dynamics that are coming through, and I think they are improving the process and improving the way that boards are thinking these things through. And I think a lot of this, as it comes back onto individual directors and their duties again, they're really putting a bit of attention into how they operate and how they engage and work very much, as you said earlier on, as a team. And that culture of the board, I think, is key to how all this is coming through as well.
Can I just give a practical example of that to bring that to life as well? So I was not the guinea pig, but the first time it came out when I was in Serco about 3 or 4 years ago. I spent the first, I did the first 2-year stint as an employee voice NED, and then we're rotating it at Serco. So another of my colleagues, Dame Sue Owen, is now the similar one. And now on Piso Cousins, being chair of Remco, I'm working with our employee voice NED. So this brings a whole load of governance together to say, once a year, how do we consult on workforce remuneration? And so me as chair of Remco, because I need to do that as chair of Remco, does the session with the employee voice NED, the designated NED, and we discuss and consult with the HR leadership team to hear from them in one big session. Okay, what's happening in this market? What's happening in that market? What should we know about? What are your views on this? So it's bringing two pieces of governance together to try and be something practical that also helps the HR team feel included in those conversations as well as hits the governance. So I think all boards are trying things out to see yet what works. I don't think there's a silver bullet, and I think it's contextual for each, but just an example or an idea for others that you might want to take for free.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I think the fact that boards now, and I think you both alluded to the agility and the need to look forward, that boards are now willing to try. And I think if we cast our mind back 10, 15 years ago, it was a very formulaic approach, but with obviously recent events, pandemics, agility required in terms of the new generation coming through, I think it's imperative that boards do try and are flexible and able to experiment on what works well and what doesn't work well. Okay, going on to the third question. Now this is going to be interesting. Who owns the inclusive agenda at board level? Is it the chair, the CEO, the executive team, or the chief people officer? Now, interestingly, you both alluded to your preferences on this or your insight on this in your narrative earlier. It'd be great to hear what our participants think on this. And I'll be keen to go back to you firstly, Kirsty. So the chair comes out at 39% and the CEO comes out at 13%. With the executive team at 32% and the chief people officer.
So I think it's the inclusive agenda. I'm going to say it depends, because if it's in the boardroom, who owns the inclusive agenda? It's absolutely the chair. The chair runs the board, as Louis said, not runs the company. The CEO runs the company. So if it's the inclusive agenda or the inclusion inside the boardroom, it's definitely the chair. If it's inclusion inside the company, well, it's everybody does, but who's on the hook for it? The CEO is accountable for it, because the chair will look to the CEO to say, is the CEO running the company properly and having an inclusive agenda that gets the best out of people and delivers the strategy the best? and encourages talent to want to come and stay is the responsibility of the CEO. But it can't be down to them doing it. It's everybody's responsibility to drive an inclusive agenda, no matter where you are in an organization. It's nobody's right or responsibility to work in splendid isolation and expect no impact. So it's sort of all of the above. But as Louis said, there's quite a clear hierarchy in terms of accountability for specific forums, and that forum of in the boardroom, how inclusive is the board is definitely the chair. How inclusive is the company? CEO's on the hook, everybody's responsibility to do it. But it's absolutely not HR owned. HR may be the most vocal and visible catalyst, maybe the one who puts it into people policies, but HR, like everybody else, is a set of leaders, and you can't outsource it to HR to ensure there's an inclusive culture. That's the wrong way.
Louis, your view.
I saw an article this week, and it was headed up, "Why do chief diversity officers keep quitting?" Which I thought this is in the fashion industry, and it said dozens of companies who hired diversity leaders in the last 2 years have found that they've moved on from their roles because they're overworked, under-resourced. So interesting that people are appointing people in this area to actually take charge of the area. But how that actually plays out in terms of their profile and the resources that they've got at their disposal, and also the reporting lines of how that might that role actually might work, is quite interesting. So I think some of that links into who's taking responsibility for this area. But I think I'd emphasise, as Kirsty said, I think it is down to the chair at board level. But it's interesting that the executives as a group were also given quite a lot of profile in that question, because you typically have somebody who's the lead person, taking this forward. And I think that the chair and the CEO are the real focus of attention in terms of making sure that these areas are moving in the right direction.
No, thank you. And I think it'd be great just to hear some of the questions that we've had from our attendees, on both submitted previously but also live this afternoon. And one is touching actually on something that you've mentioned earlier, Kirsty, just around the compensation, and how can a company ensure its compensation and benefits policies remain inclusive and supportive for all? Can you elaborate, because you talked around the employee engagement and employee voice as REMCO chair at PZ Cousins. Can you just give us a bit more depth on that, please?
So on all the boards I'm serving, there's now a sort of a scorecard at the remuneration committee level that tracks, okay, what policies are applying to the executive directors, what policies and structures are applying to the next level of leadership. And so there's have we got a mirror to put ourselves up to as the remuneration committee, that we're not excluding people, or that the policies are aligned? Because I think previously a lot of boards would sit and only focus the remuneration activity, because that's what you have to report externally, on the executive directors, typically the CEO and CFO. But now the expectation, quite right, is that you should have, while your decision making on the remuneration committee is about those roles, your remit extends to responsibility to make sure there is alignment and or not misalignment, and that your shareholders, your owners, you can prove to your owners that you are ensuring it's fair, it's transparent, it's explainable, and it's creating shareholder value as well as workforce equity. So there's quite a lot you're doing now in the remuneration committee to check on that. There's the other point, as I said, about consulting on your remuneration structure, and people are working out, what does consulting mean? Does it mean having a chat? Does it mean really asking and then doing something about? Does it mean discussing and tweaking? What does that mean? And that's not quite clear yet. I do think, though, there is a responsibility on remuneration committee chairs also to lay out in the remuneration policy things that are aligned with strategy, but also understandable by the workforce. I mean, when I started as a REM chair, partly it was terrifying because I thought, gosh, I've now got to be this sort of person who's got to be some sort of actuary who can explain the unexplainable, because apparently it's all got to be really, really complicated. But it doesn't have to be. What in fact it shouldn't be. It should be, where's the company going? Therefore, how should the most senior people be incentivized to ensure that it supports them to do it? And how do you make sure the workforce is also similarly treated fairly and included in some of those programs so that they can play their part and deliver? So as a remuneration committee chair, I'm trying to make sure everything's as simple and explainable and relevant as possible, because there's all sorts of terminology that is excluding STIP, LTIP, PSPs, RSUs. I mean, goodness me, let's boil it down to what we're trying to do. And it's not easy as a REM chair, I can tell you. I sometimes wonder why I am one, because there's not a huge amount of upside, other than it is, you learn a lot. But there's an awful lot of governance. You don't have much room to maneuver as a remuneration committee anymore, because whatever you do, somebody's going to be unhappy, whether it's a regulator, but most often it's a shareholder group or a particular investor group, and everybody wants something different. So I think as a remuneration committee, you have to try really hard to be simple, transparent, clear, aligned. You have to hold yourself up in the mirror and say, it's our direct accountability maybe for these 2 or 3 roles, but our remit needs to be able to speak to our owners, because we're in the middle of the owners and the company, to say, this is how it hangs together, and there's a story to be told, and it's equity and people have involvement. And a great way to involve people, if you are a listed company, is to do share save schemes or share incentive screens, save as you earn, or SIP plans for employees, because people, it may feel unpopular at the moment. Why would people want to put into a share scheme? They haven't got any money, cost of living. But actually flip it on its head. If you make it really small amounts, people might find it a good form of saving and might find it a discipline, and they can be involved in their company and feel like, again, they belong and they've got a bit of stake in it. So I think there's quite a lot we can and should be doing and already are doing. And back to just finally Louise's point on boards are trying things out. I think because the strictures of governance, particularly in the UK, are so strong now, particularly on remuneration committees and everywhere else, boards are having to try things out to try and make sure that you own your story. It's right for the company, because you know you're going to upset somebody. Somebody's going to vote you down on something, because everybody has an element of governance that they can pick on to say, oh, you're doing it wrong. So boards are almost becoming a bit more courageous to make sure that they get what's right for the company, because the governance is really quite challenging, and you'll never please everybody. So know your story.
Louis, anything to add?
Yeah, I think on remuneration, I think, again, I think Kirsty's really provided a good summary there, but I think also that it's also moving down from just the executive pay elements, and the remuneration committee is getting more involved in the next sort of layers down. So again, I think it helps to join some of those dots and just to see how that works through. I also had a few other sort of points which link into what Kirsty said in terms of, I think with ESG in particular, there are some new metrics and new benchmarking activities that have come through. I agree with the transparency point of view, but I think also there's a fairness that's coming through also very strongly in terms of, does it sound fair in terms of, how we're differentiating between people? And I think there needs to be aspirations that you try to achieve, but also they need to be achievable in themselves. So you're very much working on merit and results, but you need to make sure that you are rewarding people in the most appropriate way. And I think I really wholeheartedly agree with Kirsty in terms of the complexity and how this area has really been misunderstood. We run training sessions for REMCOs 3 or 4 times a year. And the last session we were running online, we had 150 people sign up for a training session, a half-day training session, which you would expect for a webinar, but you wouldn't expect for an actual training session in terms of going into all the details. So I think people feel they need some more support and understanding of this area in particular.
It's spot on, Louis, as well, because you become a REM chair and you're supposed to just know it all. but nobody's actually told you where to go find it out. And it's almost a case of there's all this bravado in the room where everybody looks, oh yes, I know exactly what you mean, and I'm conversant in this, and nobody really is. So you have, you have to pick it up on the job really fast. So I think your training programs, I'm not surprised they're well subscribed.
I think, not wishing to end on a negative, but I'd be very keen just to hear a point from you both around pitfalls or things to be aware of in terms of leading an inclusive culture. What's worked perhaps particularly well, or what hasn't worked at all. And sometimes we can all get learnings from experiences of others. Any thoughts, Kirsty?
So I'm going to maybe say something a bit controversial. Inclusion is not the same as diversity. So you can have the seemingly most demographically undiverse population that can be hugely inclusive. It's a rare event. You can similarly have a hugely demographically diverse team that is not inclusive at all. Again, a fairly rare event, but don't confuse the two. And inclusion, just because you may have great diverse workforce doesn't mean inclusion will just pop up. You have to work really, really hard at it. And Louis said it really well. It is a change management exercise. If you haven't got one now, an inclusive culture, it's a change management exercise, and it will take patience and passion and pragmatism and pig-headedness and practicalities and etc. Any P you can think of, as well as the C's. But don't think one is the same as the other. It's way not, and work hard at it because it'll never stop. And it's your responsibility as a leader to create the conditions.
Louis, final thoughts from you.
I started with 4 C's. I'm closing with 4 different C's. I think there's an element of care here in terms of the people side. There's a commitment to make sure that you do the right things and you follow it through. There's a community aspect in terms of bringing people together and a common feeling of working together. And I think a lot of this comes through also from the last C, which is confidence. There's a confidence factor. And I think particularly talking about new people coming onto boards and getting a board that is diverse and inclusive, quite often there's a lack of confidence of really skillful professional people who perhaps lack the confidence to take that step to think about themselves as a board member. And we're really encouraging people to look at their own career prospects and to plan for that at an earlier stage and really think through how they can get involved, because there are a lot of people out there who really make good board members, and they're not really stepping up and sort of moving forward in that direction.
Yes,
So
don't believe the hype that you've got to be a CEO or a CFO to be a board member. I've not been either, and I'm not a lawyer, an engineer, or an accountant, but I have been a board member on FTSE companies for 8 years and counting. So yeah, it's something for everybody, and I love it.
Thank you. Kirsty, Louis, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you very much both for your insight and commentary and sharing your experiences. Thank you all for attending. Our next webinar will be in October, and then it'll be our third session on ESG in a row. So we will be focusing very much on the ESG agenda in October. So please do join us then. Until now, thank you very much to you both, and we'll speak soon. Goodbye.